Hello, my name is Tim Darst, and I'm going to be your tour guide today for this virtual environmental justice tour. We've given over 120 of these tours to over 2,000 people in the last 10 years. I hope you enjoy the tour. I'm here at the corner of 17th and Breckenridge Streets outside of the Heaven Hill Distillery warehouses for the first stop on our tour. These warehouses store whiskey as it ages. You can see how tall and long they are. You can smell the whiskey as it wafts up through the sewer grates and through the windows of the building. This odor is often referred to as the angel's share. That's the whiskey that doesn't get consumed but evaporates. It's airborne whiskey, and it settles on the houses across the street and causes black mold to form. Living across the street from the distillery has a number of issues, but this black mold, you can see very clearly on the siding in this house here, is a perennial problem for the residents that live here. This black mold isn't just an eyesore, it's also a health issue, because the spores from the mold become a respiratory issue for many of the residents. Another issue are the trucks that are constantly coming up and down the road, hauling in whiskey. This is Interstate 264, near where it crosses Broadway in the west end of Louisville. The interstate comes really close to the houses in this neighborhood. In addition to the noise pollution, health studies have shown that children that grow up in close proximity to interstates have reduced lung capacity as adults. This is Shawnee Park at the very end, the western end of Broadway. It's one of the most beautiful parks, one of the larger parks, the anchor parks. That's the Gallagher Plant. It's owned by Duke Energy. It's one of the dirtiest coal-fired power plants in the country. The wind direction, of course, is west to east, so the residents of the west end get that pollution. This is the lake in Chickasaw Park. They have found dioxins in this lake. They've removed the water, removed the fish, restocked it with fish, and found more dioxins. So it's in the sediment, it's in the ecosystem. They're not sure exactly where it comes from, but it's close to Rubbertown. It's also right across from this petroleum terminal operated by Marathon. This is the Foreman Sewage Treatment Plant, a large sewage treatment plant that, as you can imagine, has lots of odors in the neighborhood. We're now on Bell's Lane in the heart of Rubbertown. Rubbertown is a series of chemical plants that were built here during the Second World War. The government took over control of these plants to make rubber for the war effort. By 1944, this was the largest rubber producing area in the United States. Thousands of people moved from the rural parts of Kentucky to Louisville to work at these factories and help support the war. After the war was over, they turned control back to the private businesses. But in the 50s, they started realizing this was a real health problem. The particulate matter pollution, as well as the toxic emissions, were having an adverse impact on the health of the people. But they did nothing for decades. And it wasn't until the late 90s when residents of the West End worked with the University of Louisville and got a grant from the Environmental Protection Agency to start monitoring the air. That's when they found dangerously high levels of toxic chemicals. Things like 1,3-butadiene, which are known human carcinogens, at levels much higher than in other communities. So they worked, the residents in U of L worked with the Air Pollution Control District and rallied and marched and protested and got changes made to the air regulations. What you're seeing now is a ditch next to earthen berms that hold back calcium hydroxide. It's a byproduct from carbide industries. You can see the murky kind of color in the ditch lets you know that that calcium hydroxide is leaching out and gets into the waterways, into the sewage systems. But millions of pounds of toxic air are released every year from the West End, from rubber town industries. The residents were successful at getting a new regulation called STAR, Strategic Toxic Air Reduction Program, which did work to reduce emissions from these factories. But the emissions are still there, and you can smell it on most days, and the chronic effects mean that the people that live in this area have a higher risk of getting cancer. These are more the calcium hydroxide piles and the leachate in the ditch. At the end of Bell's Lane here, where the calcium hydroxide pools end, we find a power plant called the Paddy's Run Power Plant. It was originally a coal-fired power plant. Now it's a natural gas plant here at the end of Bell's Lane. On the backside of Bell's Lane, on Campground Road, we find Chemours. It's a DuPont company that makes the plastic coating that goes on solar panels. Next to that, it used to be Roman Haas, but now it's owned by Dow Chemical, where they make plexiglass. Just past Dow Chemical is American Synthetic Rubber Company. It's owned now by Michelin Tires. They make bales of rubber here for tires and for other products. American Synthetic Rubber Company recently applied for a permit to release more toxins in the air than the STAR program originally let them do, and Metro Council approved that. This is all American Synthetic Rubber Company. Our next stop after Campground Road is Lake Dreamland. This was an area originally a summer resort built by Ed Hartledge on his old dairy farm out here in western Jefferson County. These were all cabins where people could come and live for the summer and get away from all the pollution in the city. But 1937 brought the flood to this area. And then soon after the flood, the city built a flood wall. We're growing over that flood wall now. We're going up. It's you can see the levee here. So now on this side of the flood wall, these homes are outside the protection of the flood wall. Flood wall divided the city. Chemical companies came in after the war and brought with them a lot of toxic pollution. So Lake Dreamland has really gone down in terms of environmental quality. Ed Hartledge had dammed up Bramer's Run to make a lake. We're about to cross the dam here after we go past this park. This is the dam. We should be able to see the lake here in a second. And there it is. So this lake, unfortunately, as you can imagine, is polluted. The homes that we're going to see next aren't hooked to the city sewer system. Instead, they have a system called constructed pits, where the sewage goes down into a central area and is supposed to soak down into the ground, but it's not working. And so that sewage is leaking out into the lake. The city has pledged to buy these homes from the residents. They have the ability to stay there for the rest of their lives. You'll see some of these lots have been already torn down. The city's bought the houses back and is removing them. But many of the people stay here for generations. There's an empty lot there. When Ed Hartledge had this resort, he took his old barn and converted it to horseback riding. It later became a nightclub that in the 1970s ended up burning to the ground. It was called El Rancho. Right here is the site of the El Rancho nightclub that burned down. So it was a really nice place with horseback riding, access to the river. These homes here have the Ohio River in their backyard. I don't know if you can see it there. Those hills in the back are Indiana. So at one time it was a nice place, but then came the floods, then came the chemical companies and the flood wall, and it's fallen in disrepair. And that is Lake Dreamland. Next is Hexion. Hexion's a chemical company. It's one of the largest producers of formaldehyde in the world. Hexion has had to settle lawsuits with the residents, reimbursing them for loss in property values. They had to invest some of that into pollution control equipment because of the accidental releases of toxic chemicals. These homes here are Riverside Gardens, a housing development that goes back to the 1920s. It predates the chemical companies. Through Riverside Gardens is Lee's Lane. At the end of Lee's Lane is the Lee's Lane landfill. This is a super fun site. So Joseph Hofgesang used this originally as a quarry and then later as a landfill. He filled this area in with millions of cubic yards of commercial, industrial, and domestic waste. He got in trouble when the neighbor started seeing flames shooting up near their water heaters. The organic matter was decomposing. The methane was backing up into the homes. 1975, they shut this landfill down, came back 10 years later, and found hundreds of barrels of toxic waste on the surface. That's when it was listed as a Superfund site. Superfund's federal legislation aimed at cleaning up toxic waste sites. The Hofgesang estate was fined millions of dollars, and that money was used to clean up the surface of the property. That building there has a fan that siphons off the methane. But you can see with the ditches, there's issues here with groundwater being contaminated. They found toxins in the soil. We'll walk back to the back of the property now. Here we are at the back of the property on the bank of the Ohio River, and this is where most of the erosion was happening. They brought in truckloads of gravel and large rocks to keep down the erosion here. You can see the residents like taking shots at the signs. But underneath all of this is still a lot of toxic waste. It rains on this area and leaches out into the Ohio River regularly. Further downriver from the Lees Lane landfill is the LG&E power plant. It was originally a coal-fired power plant. They've torn down the coal generators, and these are natural gas generators here, producing electricity for the residents of Louisville. We're going to head down to the coal ash pile that was accumulated over the years of burning coal at this site. This is the far end of the LG&E site. This is where the coal ash is being landfilled. You see that hill up there? It's 14 stories tall, a mile long. It's full of toxic chemicals like arsenic and selenium. And it's buried here for generations, will leach out into the Ohio River, but it's overshadowing this pauper cemetery where the indigent get buried. Our final stop on the tour is this contaminated site near Dixie Highway and Wilson Avenue. In a residential area, this is a factory that used to make DDT and dieldrin, very toxic chemicals. And they found recently that those chemicals had leached out into the backyards of the neighbors. And for decades, the neighbors didn't know it. And it wasn't until recently that they just cleaned it up. Well, I hope you found this tour interesting. I hope that many of the things that you saw on the tour today stay in your hearts and in your minds and move you to action, because there are things that we can do to make a difference. First, we could all call our Metro Council members and ask them to pass an environmental justice ordinance that would prevent things like this from happening in the future. Industrial sites close to people's homes, things like that. We can also reduce our consumption of plastics. Many of the plastics and rubbers that are made in Rubber Town add pollution to the air, and we are a part of the problem if we continue to consume plastic at the rate that we do. Find alternatives. Use reusable ceramic, glass, metal containers and utensils. Try to avoid plastics whenever you can. We can also reduce the amount of electricity that we get from coal by reducing our electricity. Turning off lights when we're not using them. unplugging our cell phone charger when we're not using it, lowering the thermostats at our homes. Find ways to cut back on the electricity at your house. We can all work together to make a difference in this world if we each do our part.